What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we are checking out the new Motorola Moto G 5G. Now, here in the US, this phone sits sort of in the middle of Motorola's smartphone lineup. It's a couple steps above the Moto G Pure and Moto G Power, but not quite as feature-packed as the Moto G Stylus. I'm gonna go over everything you need to know about this new Moto phone here, but first things first, let's just quickly unbox it so I can show you what all comes inside the package when you buy one. Slicing into the sticker and pulling off the lid, the first thing we're greeted by is the phone itself, all nicely wrapped up, and we'll take a closer look at it in just a second. Digging a little deeper inside Motorola's familiar packaging here, you'll also find the SIM ejector tool tucked away on a piece of cardboard and a couple sheets of paperwork and instructions to help you set up your new phone. At the very bottom of the box, Motorola still includes some charging accessories for their device, which is nice to see. You get a USB-A to USB-C cable paired with a small 10-watt power brick, which nowadays is a bit slow, but at least it still comes bundled with the phone. With all that stuff out of the way, here is the new Moto G 5G once again. Just one color option for this phone. Motorola actually calls it Moonlight Gray, but I think it's closer to a steel blue. The Moto G 5G is a decent-sized 6.5-inch smartphone. That's a screen size corner to corner. And this time around, we get a center hole punch selfie camera and noticeable bezels bordering the display, with a decent bottom chin. I feel like Motorola every other year just flip-flops between a corner selfie camera and the center one, but either way, a decent, familiar-looking phone from the front, but definitely not the best use of bezels, with just an 81% screen-to-body ratio. Around back, the Moto G is all plastic from top to bottom and side to side. I feel like Motorola has used this same design and form factor for a few years now. There's nothing wrong with it. It's fairly clean and simple. No real camera bump, textured finish, matte sides, and some curves and contours along the edges to keep things comfortable in your hand. A relatively comfortable device to hold and use. This size, I think, is what most people are used to. It's not that tall, elongated smartphone like some other devices. The G Stylus is that way. This one is big for sure, a bit of a stretch, but not awkward or overwhelming. Taking a quick look around at everything else, on the left side, dual SIM and SD card slot for expandable storage, though you do get 256 gigs of onboard storage already with this phone. On the right, usual volume buttons there alongside the power button, which also doubles as your fingerprint sensor. Down at the bottom, the headphone jack remains. You've got the USB-C port in the middle there, and single downward firing speaker. Center hole punch selfie camera, like I mentioned, earpiece slit across the very top, and around back you'll find a triple lens camera setup, which I'll go more in depth with in just a bit. Jumping back to the display, the 6.5-inch screen on the Moto G is an IPS LCD panel coming in at a resolution of 1600 by 720, pushing around 270 pixels per inch. At this size, that's just not really the best resolution. You can pick out those pixels on screen, even from a somewhat normal viewing distance, so sharpness and clarity are a bit lacking to say the least. On the bright side, the display here is 90 Hz, so you get the slightly faster feel with a high refresh rate. Your taps, touches, swipes, and scrolls all feel quicker and more responsive. And this to me is a nice addition. When it comes to the out loud listening experience, like I mentioned already, just the one single speaker down at the bottom, and here's a sound sample so you can get an idea. Inside, this Moto G 5G is powered by the MediaTek Dimensity 700 chipset, which is sort of an upper mid-range processor that I know I like and that I think a lot of other people do too. Paired with 6 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of built-in storage, here are the Geekbench scores if you happen to be keeping a ranking. These specs are more than enough to power through those graphics-heavy apps and games with ease. Also, this is a Moto device that does ship with the latest version of Android 12. So out of the box, the phone does feel fresh, fast, and new. And I haven't always been able to say that with some Motorola phones. I personally felt that Motorola's Android 11 skin, for example, always felt bloated, clunky, not that well optimized, but Android 12 on this device now is honestly a welcome and refreshing change. So I'm excited to use this phone in the coming days to see just how well it holds up. I do have pretty high expectations, and like I said, I think with these specs, you should expect this phone to be able to handle a lot, so I'm really going to push it. Also, powering this phone is a fairly large 5,000 milliamp battery. Now, if there's one thing that Motorola consistently does right, it's cram as big of battery inside inside their phones as possible. This is actually the same size battery as the Moto G Power, which kind of gets its name because of the big battery. And while Motorola tends to advertise their phones as 2-day devices, I personally have experienced better than a day on average with my usage before I needed to plug it back in. Though if you're a lighter user, I could see perhaps stretching that further. And staying off the charger is kind of the name of the game with Motorola devices. The 10-watt power brick and no real fast charging option means you're stuck plugged in for multiple hours at a time, but I think you can at least avoid some range anxiety during daily use with that big battery. Finally, when it comes to the cameras, Motorola has sort of been using the same basic setup for a little while now. So we get a very familiar 50 megapixel main lens, paired with just a 2 megapixel macro and 2 megapixel depth sensor. Up front, there seems to be at least a 13 megapixel shooter, which is quite a bit better than those lesser Moto G phones I keep mentioning. But similar to what I said about the display, I think offering a bit more with the camera hardware is probably warranted on a device like this. An ultra-wide lens, for example, would have been great, better zoom options, even a higher quality macro or depth sensor if they insist on having them year after year anyway. But inside the camera app, I'm always pleased to see Motorola offer a great selection of shooting modes, features, settings, and tools that go beyond the basic point-and-shoot mid-ranger status. You've got things like dual lens capture for pictures and video, night mode, high-res 50 megapixel shooting, pro controls, a couple of other Motorola filters and add-ons. It's a great setup for sure. More than enough to even make an avid picture taker happy, but still not quite flagship caliber. No 4K video, for example, and not even 1080-60 is an option actually. With a couple of quick sample shots here out of the box, I think you can tell that while the selfie camera does give you a pretty good shot, it definitely goes overboard with its smoothing and beautifying. I look a little too silky smooth and kind of washed out, I think. But the color and contrast are decent. And zooming on in, even with that smoothing effect, there still seems to be enough detail to work with. The rear lens setup is much more balanced. There's obviously a lot of color without going too saturated, tons of detail as you zoom in closer. And I know that the hardware hasn't changed much, but I do feel like Motorola's image processing, at least, has gotten better over time. So while they maybe haven't focused a ton on those over-the-top cinema quality camera setups, the minor improvements they have made in recent years have paid dividends, and I'm interested to see how this phone does when I take it out and about for some real-world pictures and videos. All in all, this Moto G 5G seems to fill that mid-range gap, particularly in Motorola's own smartphone lineup. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though, and I'll see you guys later.